very, very old story. It's a story of the man who held the record for laziness. And I thought that was me. He was too lazy to work. Would do nothing that required any effort. He grew so lazy that his fellow townspeople, they gave up on him and decided that the only place for him would be in a pine box, a permanent place for him to rest. So they decided to bury him. Now, they decided to bury him because they were quite sure he was too lazy to die. That's pretty lazy. Anyway, they felt it was useless to await the event, so they made that pine box, and they started with him in it for the cemetery. On the way, a stranger came by. A farmer from the country came along, and he saw the man in the box, and so he asked what the story was, and they told him how lazy this man was, and how he didn't do anything and didn't have anything to live on. And the farmer said, well, wait a minute, don't bury him. But he doesn't have anything to live on, doesn't have any food, and he won't do anything to get it. The farmer said, okay, I will give him a bushel of corn. Now the man in the box kind of raised his head and said, is it shucked? The farmer said, no. The man in the box leaned back down and said, keep going, boys. Rather take that journey than do a little something, you know? It's an interesting story, I think. And sometimes in studying truth, we get into the idea, just pray about it. Just pray about it. Well, when I was in ministerial school, my beloved teacher, and I dearly loved Hypatia Hasbrook, she had us do impromptu talks one week. And the way that worked was we had no idea what we were going to have to talk about. We got to, when we were called upon, walk up to the front of the room and pull a little slip of paper out of a hat. And then whatever was on the paper is what we had to talk about. Oh, I'm such a lucky person. I went up there, I stuck my hand in there, and I said, please, God. Yeah, I mean, as a good ministerial student, you want it to be something you know what to talk. Pulled out that little piece of paper, and I opened it up. You have to pray a long time for a roast turkey to drop into your mouth. Hypatia, can I take an F right now? What? How many of you have prayed and had a roast turkey drop into your mouth? No? I've had turkeys handed to me. I once went out socially and can I say a local nightclub, and somebody was there who knew me and said, Greg, I went to the supermarket, and, you know, you got a free turkey for Thanksgiving if you bought so many groceries. He said, I've got it in the cooler here, and he said, will you take it? Give it to somebody? So I was handed a turkey. It wasn't roasted, and it didn't drop into my mouth. And sometimes I think as truth students, we hear all these kind of phrases about Leave It With God. Emily Cady, she wrote a chapter called Trusting and Resting. And we think, well, all I got to do is trust and rest. Well, wait a minute. Trusting and resting, those are active things. Do you just sit in place and do nothing when you trust? Or is not some part of you focused on believing that it will take care of itself, that God is taking care of it? That's work, is it not? It involves bringing forth your faith. There's a passage in the scripture where one of the Hebrew kings is told to gather his people as an army and take them out. And they should, when he has them in place, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, or Jehovah. How much work is standing still? How many muscles does it take to stand still? It's still an activity. There's work to be done. You pray about it, and then whatever guidance comes, whatever opens before you, you begin to follow it. Any guidance says, do this, do that, you do it. Somebody once coined the phrase. He was an accountant, and he was teaching us accounting principles for churches. And he used a phrase that I think is very apropos. He said, put legs on your prayers. Don't just pray, but do. Put it into action. God created us out of its very own image and likeness. We say God is creator, but then what are we? Are we not co-creators with God? Our opening statement, God is love, life, wisdom, and power. But those things in action, they're not static concepts. What would you have if you didn't have life in action? Nothingness. Power that isn't in action is not power. Love that isn't active, expressed, felt, isn't love. Wisdom. What does wisdom accomplish if it isn't in use? Put into action. So, sometimes it's hard to remember. You pray about it, and then you do what comes to you in guidance, maybe some words from a friend, maybe something comes to you, a book opens before you. However your guidance comes, you start to take steps toward your good. There's an old spiritual principle that is at work in your physical body. I say it's a spiritual principle because it's the same concept. You need to be active. What happens when you don't move? When you just sit and do nothing? You could sit. My grandmother had a rocking chair in her bedroom. Bedroom was at second floor front of the house, and she had 4 windows there. And the rocking chair was next to a octagonal large table. And she kept her prayer cards and things there, and every day she rocked in that rocking chair. And she prayed, and she prayed, and she prayed. Oh, she did novenas, she did all kinds of prayers. And sat in that same rocker and worried where her daughter was, why she wasn't home yet, rocking away, afraid something happened to her daughter Corinne. A lot of time was spent in prayer. And we can do the same. There comes a time where we need to take steps. The human body needs exercise for our own well-being, for it to stay healthy, for it to stay strong. Our muscles were given to us to use. You can't take a breath without it being an active process. You've got to use muscles to breathe. Your heart is a muscle causing your blood to circulate. I can't take a drink of water unless somebody turned on a tap and filled the bottle for me, yeah? But then I had to do something to get it open so I can drink it. But even the process of drinking is action. There'd be no electric light if somebody hadn't built a generator someplace. No gasoline if somebody hadn't drilled for oil and then refined it so that you could put it in your automobile. We would have nothing whatsoever if someone had not exerted some effort to bring it about, to bring it into being. There's a story in 1 Kings, the 17th chapter. I think it's in the 4th verse, about Elijah. And it says, the ravens will feed him. Well, that sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? The ravens. Maybe you have ravens that come and feed you. Or later in that chapter, there's the story of the woman with the cruse of oil, the widow, and how the oil continues to flow, that it did not fail. Maybe you've got one of those magic cruises of oil. But there's still effort. The ravens didn't feed Elijah without some effort on their part. The cruse of oil did not flow without some effort on the prophet's part. There's no sense in studying and trying to apply truth principles if we don't take common sense as a part of it. I think the only condition in which we get what we desire is by using what we have, our talents, our abilities, our faculties. When I was in school and I worked with the retreat department, I used to do retreat programming with a variety of people, and one was James Dillard Freeman. And I remember sitting backstage listening to Jim Freeman do one of his evenings with James Dillard Freeman. Retreatants always loved that. And in this particular one, he was telling stories. And he told a story about using what you have for what you have to use it for. And that phrase of his always stuck in my memory. Use what you have for what you have to use it for. And what do you have? You have a mind. You have a heart. You have feelings. You have faculties. You have intelligence. Use what you have for what you have to use it for what is before you, for pursuing the good you desire in life. Even spiritual activities, like meditation. That is an activity. That requires concentration. And for some, it seems to be a bit of work to get into the habit of it. Oh, habits. Habits. We think of habits in the negative. But habits, I believe, are created for our good. For example, how do you end up with a habit? You do the same thing over and over, right? We think about lack over and over and over, and what do we experience in our lives? Sense of lack. We build that rut that the mind just then falls into it. But what happens if we built a habit of thinking prosperity, of thinking health, of thinking love and peace and joy? Wouldn't that build a rut you'd like to be in? A track that your mind would automatically follow because it became habit to think of God's good, God's presence, God's power. Habits are very good. It's just for us to decide what's a positive habit and what's not. What brings us what we want and what it doesn't, what we don't want. Prayer is a wonderful thing. But in Unity, we used to say, go to God first, and then to man as God directs. Seek the guidance, and then put legs on your prayers. Because we are here to work together. We are here to work with and for and through each other. One of my, a man I considered a friend, and a man I have long admired, Ernest Wilson. As Jim Freeman said to me one day as we were walking to the 11 o'clock Silent Unity prayer service, he said, Greg, Ernest was a minister's minister. He was an outstanding man. And he once said, it is easier to pull out a splinter than to pray it out. I always thought that was kind of good common sense advice, don't you? You get a splinter. Next time you get a splinter, try this. You look at it good and carefully. And then you start saying, thank you, God, for taking this splinter out of my finger. And after you've done that 300 or 400 times, what do you think's going to be the state of the splinter? I think it's going to be tired of hearing you talk to it like that. Tweezers. Oh, done. You know, sometimes it is for us to do. Pray first, but then put your prayers into action. Frank Hansen was my second Unity minister that I knew and whose church I went to in Cincinnati. My first one was Grover Thornsbury. When the church in Seattle stole him from us, I ended up at a different church playing organ, and Frank Hansen was the minister. He made his transition as I was right in the middle of my second year ministerial school. So at Christmas time, I went back to Cincinnati and participated in his memorial service. And then later his wife called me and she said that he had willed all his books to me, his library. And that was an amazing collection. And with it, there were some boxes of 3x5 cards, notes, talk notes. And they were all wrapped with rubber bands. And I remember picking up the first little stack of them with the rubber band, and I started to remove the rubber band, and it went broke. Then I looked in the box, and there were more that had already broken. You know, rubber is one of the most flexible and stretchable things that we know. But if it's allowed to just sit and it isn't exercised, what happens? It dries out. It becomes brittle. I understand that same thing is true of automobile tires. If they sit too long, unflexed, unused, you just said dry rot. That happens to us too. Did you ever have dry rot? Yeah. I think we all have had the opportunity. Steel rusts. Things atrophy, muscles. Affections fade when they're not expressed, when they're not used. God created things to be used. He meant us to use them. He built us that way. He made skill depend on practice. Have you noticed that? It works for musicians, it works for athletes, it works for anything. Seamstress, housemakers, cooks. Practice makes us better. And I think habits are one of the strongest influences in our lives. And they can be very much for good if it's a positive habit. If it's a habit that brings us what we want instead of what we don't want. God made us all co-creators, created of His very own Spirit. He expected us to create, to take the stuff of the universe and express His good. He didn't expect us, well, He probably did. He knew us better than we know ourselves. Yeah, they'll just sit there and they'll hold up a basket and expect me to fill it. Or stand with their mouths open expecting the turkey to fly into it. I wish I could tell you what I said in that talk. I got an A from Hypatia, but I have no idea what I said. When you don't know what else to do, you tap dance. Everything that works to save us from challenges, from trouble, that works for our spiritual growth is some form of activity. Prayer is an activity. Meditation is an activity. Affirmation is an activity. You don't just sit and be a chair warmer and all good falls into your life. You are the image likeness of God, a co-creator with God. I think deep down we're only really satisfied in our lives when we are creating. When you create something, don't you feel good about it? Don't you feel like you've contributed something? Aren't you proud of what you've done? What you've brought forth? You bake a cake and it's perfect. You sing a song and people are moved. You say some words and a life is changed. All of that is creative. And I think it's by design that it feels good to do it. God is love. God is life. God is wisdom. God is power. But they're all in action. All things to do and express. And that God life is in us. That God love seeks to express through us. God wisdom seeks to guide and direct us. But what can it do if we don't look at it and follow it? And God power for us to use in our lives, making the presence and power of God more visible in this world. Be a co-creator. Be a beneficial presence in the world that helps, that says whatever is needed in the moment, that seeks to do God's work.